Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. Where I'd like to start today is by basically telling you everything that you need to know about this presentation in about the first minute. That way, if I run over, you've got it. Or if you feel like leaving, you're going to know what the story is. So I want to begin by introducing everyone to a concept with which you may be familiar, I don't know, or you may not. But this is the core idea that I'm going to be talking about today. And the concept is narrative identity. Basically, all of us, everybody in this room, we're storytellers. And we tell stories primarily to ourselves. This is how we construct our sense of self, our identity. We arrange our memories, our past experiences, our notion of who we were, who we are today, who we're aspiring to be, into narratives that give our lives meaning and coherence. So we're all constantly editing and crafting these stories and trying to get the facts of our lives to align with the narrative identity we're trying to construct for ourselves. That's the first thing I'd like you to remember. And this is true for us, it's true for your consumers. The second thing I want you to remember is that we don't construct our narrative identity, our sense of self, these stories, out of a vacuum. We draw from the culture that's around us. And we draw from a couple of different sources that I'll cover in the presentation today. The first source is from the mythology of the culture in which we're immersed. We all grow up surrounded by cultural mythology, by the myths of our culture. And we can't help but draw from those narrative themes, those story arcs, as we're constructing our own stories. We try to align the events of our lives to create our personal stories along the lines of those myths that we're familiar with. If you're American, like me, you grew up in the Midwest, Manifest Destiny, the American Dream, the rugged individualist, the triumph of the individual against whatever odds are before him, those are all ingrained in you since birth. If you grew up in other cultures, you're immersed in other mythologies. But we can't help but draw from those and incorporate those into our own stories. Those become our templates. The second source that I'd like you to remember are cultural artifacts. Again, we're surrounded by cultural artifacts from popular culture, from religion, from all the different sources to which we're exposed as we grow up. And we incorporate those into our personal mythology as well. And if we look through the lens of narrative identity, brands are cultural artifacts. Brands contain symbolic meaning. And we use brands, we incorporate brands into our stories to help give them consistency, to smooth over inconsistencies and tensions that we have in our stories. So the second thing I want you to remember, two sources that we use to create our narrative identity: the mythology of the culture in which we're immersed and the artifacts that we're exposed to from our culture. And brands are one of those types of artifacts. The final thing is that knowing that your consumers are constantly editing and re-editing their narrative identities, knowing that brands and cultural mythology are their sources for constructing those sources, we as insights professionals, as brand strategists, need to be spending a little bit more time listening to our consumer stories. Typically, we do research projects, we go right in, we begin talking about our category, our brand, our competitors' brands. Rarely do we step back and listen to our customers talk about themselves, share their stories, and then through that lens begin to understand, how does our brand fit into their life story? Does our brand play a role? Does it even have a bit part in my consumer's narrative identity? The brands that do are the brands that have really profound and deep meaning to people's lives. If you have a brand that plays a role in your consumer's life story, you've got something. You've got a deep connection. So I'm from Kentucky, born and raised there, live there now. When I was in high school, my father got me a job working for the Kentucky State Highway Department in Kenton County, Kentucky. So I spent the summer shoveling blacktop, spreading hot mix, picking up litter on state highways across Kentucky. He did that basically to impress upon me what kind of work I would be doing if I didn't finish college. And the joke in our family is, it had such an impact that I didn't stop until I had a PhD. So it was a pretty effective technique that my dad used. But that is a scene from my personal life, my narrative identity. That's become very important to me. I learned a lot that summer. And in many ways, that was the summer when I transitioned from boyhood to manhood. The guys that I worked with on that crew were determined to make a man out of me in many ways. That involved chewing tobacco, learning how to drink large quantities of beer, learning how to lie about my sexual exploits, and that clearly was myth-making, I will tell you that. Still is to this day. You know, so that experience for me, it taught me the value of hard work, and it was the first experience I had where I worked hard and earned a paycheck. It gave me a level of respect for a group of guys who belonged to a socioeconomic class that I really had no contact with up until that point. And it also gave me the ability to feel like I've experienced a little bit of the American dream. That I rose up from a humble beginning to achieve something in life, became the owner of a company, and it allows me to sort of tell that story to myself. And I've repeated that story a million times, pretty much that same way, to a number of people. And I like the symbolic value of it. The story kind of plays against type a little bit. You wouldn't expect me to, couldn't imagine somebody like me out shoveling blacktop all summer long. But also, it's an important story for me. I repeat that story to myself to reaffirm something I want to believe about myself, that I've somehow risen from humble beginnings. There's a lot of facts in my history that contradict that. But I want to believe in that story. And I think all of us who grew up in this country have a piece of us that wants to believe we're the individual who has achieved. And we try to incorporate that into our identity. Now, there's a couple of important things about the story that I've just told you. One, it's a particularly American story. At least there's a couple of psychologists would argue that. And secondly, there's a brand that plays an important role in that story, and we'll get to that later. Now, just very quickly, I tried to find a picture of my old State Highway Department barn. The barn is where they keep all the heavy equipment, and that's where we would meet in the morning before we would go out and do our road crew responsibilities. And I couldn't find a picture of it. Interestingly, when you Google Kentucky State Highway Department or Kenton County, Kentucky State Highway, the only image that comes up is this one, which is gruesome, but every time I see it, I can't help but laugh. It's from a sheriff's department dashboard camera of a deer strike. And I guess it is relevant to some degree because I did spend a lot of time that summer picking up deer carcasses off of state highways. So anyway. So the story I told you is a particularly American story. I said that just a moment ago. And there are themes in that story from my life, themes that tap into the notion of the American dream, the triumph of the individual, themes of development that Dan McAdams, the psychologist whose quote was up there just a few minutes ago, would call thematic stories of redemption. Okay? McAdams argues that American mythology is characterized by this notion of redemption, that we move from negative experiences to positive experiences, from sin to forgiveness, from enslavement to emancipation, from poor to rich, illness to recovery. We become enlightened. We develop and grow as human beings. This is a book, comes from a book called The Redemptive Self, which if you can get a copy of it, it's definitely worth a read, because it's a great example, a great illustration of the way that we use in American culture specific cultural myths and incorporate those into our personal stories. And McAdams would argue every culture does this. Every individual in each culture is drawing from their cultural mythology to create their sense of self. In my story, I'm doing the exact same thing. I also mentioned that a brand plays an important role in my story. There's a brand strategist named Will Novy, and I've stolen this quote from him because I loved it. I heard him say this in a presentation once, and it's the great definition of a brand that I've heard in recent memory. We use brands to tell ourselves stories about who we are. I think we all understand that brands have important symbolic value. We use brands to say to other people something about ourselves or to project an image. But what Nobi would argue, and what I support, is this notion that we use brands to tell ourselves stories. The brands that have real meaning for us are the ones that we purchase, that we use, that we have a bond with in order to convince ourselves of some reality. Now, the brand that plays a role in my story is this one. And actually, as Steve pointed out to me when I was taking him through this presentation earlier, this picture is not accurate. I couldn't find one that actually was. The accurate picture would be of a glass quart of Pabst Blue Ribbon, because these guys on the State Highway Department crew, who were determined to make a man out of me that summer, would take me to lunch in a bar in Covington, Kentucky, 2-3 times a week, and we'd come in with our brown bags, and we'd sit at the bar, and we'd get out our bologna sandwiches, and we ordered Pabst Blue Ribbon by the quart, and we'd sit there at the bar and drink, and then we'd all get back into 7-ton dump trucks and go flying down the state highways of Kentucky. This brand still, for me, is a marker. It's an important marker of that period of my life, the scene in my life in which I became a man, and in which I can allow myself to tap into this notion that I lived this little part of the American dream, that I started here. And now I have a fridge full of overpriced microbrews and imports. But there's still a little Pabst Blue Ribbon in there right now. That brand has important symbolic meaning for me, as well as for the people that are around when I crack one open. The brand plays an important role in my story. So, going back to where I started, what does this mean for us as insights professionals, as brand strategists? Just a couple of things. As I said earlier, I don't think we spend nearly enough time listening to our consumers tell stories about their lives. We go right in for a conversation about our brand, about our category. And I got news for you. They don't care, okay? People would much rather talk about themselves than they would your brand. So ask people to tell stories about themselves. Not all the time. I know we have to test creative, we have to develop packaging, we have to optimize new product concepts. All of that work still has to get done. But once a year, I would encourage you to do a project in which you talk to your consumers and just listen to them tell stories about their lives. Collect their scenes. What are the scenes in their lives that matter to them? And then ask yourself, does my brand play a role anywhere in this? Could it? Understand how personal myths draw from cultural myths. The mythology of the culture in which your consumers exist. It could be American, it could be another culture. Those are important clues into how they might be constructing their stories. That's the raw material. Those story arcs are probably part of the narrative that they're aspiring to, the story they want to tell. And then finally, listen for the tensions, the contradictions in their story. And ask yourself, can my brand help them smooth over those contradictions? Can my brand enable them in some way to help them actualize the story they want to tell? I'm about out of time here. I'd like to just play for you an example of a brand that I think has done a great job of this. This is one of my favorite commercials of all time, and you'll see, if you watch this ad, you'll see these themes that McAdam talks about, particularly themes of development, of emancipation, okay, of personal growth that he would argue, and I would argue, are uniquely American. And you'll see how this brand has integrated that into their essence and what they've become.
Dear candidate, thank you for your application to our ballet academy. Unfortunately, you have not been accepted. You lack the right feet, Achilles tendons, turnout, torso length, and bust. You have the wrong body for ballet, and at 13, you are too old to be considered.
Thank you. Take your questions.
Hi, I'm Ava Lindberg, and I really loved the presentation. Taking from your Pabst Blue Ribbon tiny example in your refrigerator now next to all the microbrews, there are brands that are very connected to the identity of a childhood life. I'm thinking things like Kool-Aid or Campbell's, and many of these have some relevance, but others have less. And I'm curious, what do you do when you encounter a brand that had an enormous amount of early childhood historical relevance, but does not fit where the consumer is now? So I guess my question is, how easy is it to bring that brand, and how, into now, the future, with true relevance?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer, but I would say that just by understanding how your brand was integrated into that person's life story, where it fits, how it fits, is critical to understand how to make the brand relevant today. If you don't understand that, and you won't understand it unless you hear them talk about themselves and understand the context in which your brand had meaning, you won't have the right insights to begin to build relevance now in their lives. So again, I guess my recommendation would be you've got to start broadly from what matters to them. Hear their story and then understand how your brand fits into that, rather than starting with, hey, what do you think about my brand? Because the context is what's going to give you clues and give you an understanding of what the good and bad meanings are associated with that brand, so that you can leverage that to make the brand relevant in their lives today. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Jim, is this a? I got one.
Who's this guy?
Is this an American thing, or is this a anywhere thing?
No, I think this is an anywhere thing. You know, I mean, you and I were talking about the difference between McAdams and, like Jungian Archetypes, right? The difference is that McAdams would argue that narrative identity and the character you're playing in your own life story is culturally relevant. And different cultures have different narratives that people are borrowing from. So it's critical to understand what those dominant narratives are in the culture in which you're working, whether it's LATAM or the US or Asia or wherever. Jungian archetypes are supposedly universal. So that would be the difference. But I would say, yes, these dominant cultural mythologies exist everywhere. And as researchers, it's important for us to understand what they are. And that'll give us clues as to the aspirational stories our consumers are trying to tap into and tell.
Good. Any more questions?
I have a question. Just back here, sorry.
Oh, just an observation, a couple of things. One, I've seen evidence to the question that you just asked about the presence of iconic American brands in mainland China. You take Jack Daniels or Jim Beam and things like that. They're very popular among the affluent in Beijing, Guangzhou. The other thing is the Pabst Blue Ribbon brand. If you go anywhere in Brooklyn, New York, it's the #1 brand among hipsters in walk-in bars throughout New York City today. And it competes directly with Narragansett, which gained popularity in Jaws. So.
Yeah. Well, and my biggest concern is that hipsters will ruin this as a symbol in my own personal story. That is what I'm really worried about. So I try to shut that out as much as I can.
Good. Thanks very much, Jim.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all.